We'll do a sound check.
Testing?
Other mics?
Testing.
Testing.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Okay, well, welcome to Climate Impact and Other Considerations for Fish and Fisheries. My name is Jerry Brask. I'm a member of the CCL chapter in Vancouver, and I'll serve as moderator for this very knowledgeable and experienced panel. The format is that I'll pose a few questions to the panel for them to respond to and discuss. At the end of the session, there should be time for questions from the audience. And there's a handout that we've circulated that will give you additional resources regarding the impact of climate change on our waters. I'd just like to introduce the panel here before we get started. On my far right, Jim Byrne was a fish biologist for the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife for 28 years. He's currently a coordinator for Trout Unlimited. Next to Jim is Steve Sylvester, who is an associate professor in the School of Molecular Biosciences at Washington State University here in Vancouver. He's taught environmental health and many other upper division classes at the college. Bill Sharp, next to Steve, is a research scientist with Yakama Nation's Fisheries Program for over 30 years. He's done field research and flow studies in rivers in Idaho, Oregon, and Washington, and has a deep respect for the tribal culture. Jamie Judkins is treasurer of Walaka Bay Enterprise, the business arm of Shoalwater Bay Indian Tribes. She's had an integral role in the development of the tribe's oyster nursery and oyster co-op, and she is a strong advocate for the tribe's self-sustainability. And Steve Jones is a member and conservation director for Clark's Skamania Fly Fishers, a 270-member club active in many conservation issues under Steve's leadership. He's also the vice president of Fly Fishers International. So to get us started, the first question I'm going to pose to the panel for each of them to address is to describe how fish and fisheries are negatively impacted by climate change, and we'll start it off with Jim Byrne. So Jim, I think you're up.
Brian?
We're gonna have slides, or?
Yeah, we get your
You're up
slides
there.
up.
So I want to talk about how fish are impacted. You see that table up there. I hope you don't think this is a flashback to high school science. I just want to, the most important thing in this table are the temperatures of 0 centigrade, 32 Fahrenheit. So basically what water is close to freezing. The 15 degrees centigrade, 59 Fahrenheit, that's water temperatures that trout and salmon do well with. And then the 30 degree centigrade, 85 degree Fahrenheit. And I want you to just basically take a look at the amount of dissolved oxygen. At 30 degrees, it's only half of that at freezing. So can we have the next slide? That's basically the same thing, but in a graphic formula. I'm more visually oriented, so I prefer the graph. Once again, if you look at the 0 centigrade, the 15, and the 30, it's pretty obvious that there's only half the oxygen available. The lower line indicates the oxygen solubility in seawater. Because there's lots of salts and minerals in seawater, there's less oxygen available. So if we go skiing in the winter and we go for a run in July, we can do pretty well. It doesn't affect us very much. We may get hot, cranky in that July run. But for fish, it's a huge difference. There's only about half the oxygen in the room. Next slide, please. So there's also an altitude effect. The higher up you go, the less oxygen is available for fish. So I like this slide very much because it reminds me of fish Lonesome Larry. He was a Snake River sockeye. He was the only male that returned to his hatchery at Redfish Lake about 15 years ago. So that fish came out through the Columbia system, swam around the Pacific Ocean, entered the Columbia River at sea level, swam 900 miles to reach his destination in Oregon, and he had to gain nearly 2,000 meters, 1,996 meters. It's nearly 7,000 feet in elevation. So that fish was struggling under low oxygen conditions because of the elevation and also the heat of the summer. Can we have the next slide? So this is a graph of water temperatures in one of our local rivers, the East Fork of the Lewis. There's a red horizontal line. That's a line that the Department of Ecology has considered the high limit for trout and salmon species. The orange line on the bottom, there are 3 temperature stations on that river. The blue is Louisville Park. That is the most lower down in the basin. The yellow is Hyson, which is mid-basin, and the red is Sunset Falls, which is highest in the basin. So for a big stretch, this is summer of 2015, for a big stretch, the lower and middle section of the river exceeded that 64-degree Fahrenheit threshold. So any salmonids, trout and salmon would be in difficulty there. The upper section, they fared better. Can we have the next slide, please? So this is kind of a range of tolerance for cold water species, mostly trout and salmon. You can see 6 parts per million and above, they do pretty well. You get below that, fish only have about 3 choices. They either have to move to get out of the hot water, try and find a cold water refuge if they can, if there's any water upwelling from the bottom of the river, and the third choice is that they die. So it's not a good situation. With higher temperatures, there's less oxygen. Next slide, please. So the diagram on the left is oxygen requirements for freshwater species, and on the right is for marine species. The 2 fish on the top, trout and salmon, have the highest requirements. And if climate change persists on surface water supplied rivers, we will be losing those fish out of our area. The other fish, bass, carp, perch, bluegills, they'll continue to survive, and they'll eventually become Washington's sport fish. When we look on the right-hand diagram, those are marine fish. So basically, they tolerate lower oxygen temperatures better. The thing that's interesting to me is tuna and marlin. Just last summer, the state of Washington experienced marlin off the coast, 20 bluefin tuna, some as big as 90 pounds were caught. This is a very unusual situation for us. We typically don't get these warmer water species up here. Next slide, please. And the reason why we do is because in recent years, we've been having these El Nino type events or blob events. You can see those big pools of the orange reddish water expanding over the last 3 years. And those warm water fish will swim up and habitat those warm water pools. Next slide. There's the blob in 2014. Just this last summer, going into early fall, we thought another blob would be developing, just as big and just as ugly. But fortunately, with our fall wind events and currents, that massive heated water broke up. So fortunately, we're not going to experience the blob, at least this spring and summer. I'm sure we'll experience warm water events into the future. And that's all I have. Steve will have much more on the marine and shellfish situation.
Steve? Thank you. Thanks, Jim.
I have one question. So it's interesting seeing the blob from last September, then breaking up, but some of the salmon had already encountered it on their way leaving rivers here, so they might still be affected, I've heard.
So the biggest effect is the spring event, when the salmon smolts come out April, May, and June. When those blobs occur, you don't have the same forage base for the fish. You don't have this cold water zooplankton that our Columbia River salmon species need. There's less zooplankton in general, and the zooplankton that is there is more of a tropical or temperate, and it doesn't have the high level of fats that the Columbia River fish need.
Thank you for your question. We'll try to hold the questions till the end if we can, just for ease with the mics.
Thank you. So the ocean absorbs 90% of the heat of climate change and 30% of carbon dioxide. That number for carbon dioxide started in the 20s, and with refined techniques we've realized that it's moved up, and right now best guess is 31%. So this causes problems for the ocean and for all the creatures within the ocean. Next slide, please. So there were questions about measuring temperature, but I believe NASA and satellites, there's accurate science. And this shows us in the blue line that the temperature, the surface temperature of water has increased. Now 90% of the heat is going into the ocean, but yet the increase in the air temperature at the surface is higher. And that's because it's easier to heat gases than it is to heat water. It takes more calories, energy to heat water. Next slide, please. This heat in the water, we'll talk about that first, has caused increased evaporation of seawater, which increases clouds. And we're experiencing more of what are called atmospheric rivers. Here in the Northwest, we call it a pineapple express because it comes over Hawaii and hits the West Coast. And the first time when I heard on this, the speaker claimed that there was 5 times the water of the Mississippi River, and I thought, no. But then I thought about it. That group of clouds causes flooding all across the U.S. into Canada, and everything gets filled up. So that's been estimated to be more than 5 times now in the Mississippi River. But we're seeing more of these incidences. There's about 5 at any time around the world, and they are directing a lot of water. As we increase temperature, we're increasing the amount of water that's landing on the terrestrial surface, and that is causing leaching of nutrients. Plus, with droughts, we're getting fires, and fires is converting complex biomolecules into small molecules, many of them are nutrients. Rain hits it, that puts it in the river, runs it out in the ocean. Next slide, please. Once it gets into the ocean, it causes an algae bloom because all of the nutrients that are necessary for algae are present in that water, and you get a large, massive population that grows very quickly. Well, then they deplete the nutrients in that surface water, and they die, and they shrink to the bottom, and they're microorganisms, mostly bacteria. They eat them, and in the eating process, there's hydrolysis and oxidation, and we do this ourselves. We bring in carbon compounds like sugars, and then we breathe out CO2. So that's what's going on in the bottom of the ocean. Well, this oxygen that is required for us to combust our food and for the bacteria to depletes the oxygen in the water in those low levels. So we have deserts that occur or dead zones. And you've probably seen pictures where it's just kind of gray and ghost-like with dead crab shells and fish all over the place. So this is messing with these lower level species around the world, wherever you see orange. Next slide, please. As far as CO2 goes, it accumulates in the atmosphere in the wintertime. That's when we're burning a lot of fossil fuels to generate heat, And there is little photosynthesis to incorporate it. So in the summer, the upper panel, we see a lot of the red and the yellow, and this just boils and churns around as the earth spins. In the wintertime. And at April, at the end of winter, that's when the accumulation is greatest. But then 4 months later, in the summer, it's gone, because it has been incorporated into plants. And so photosynthesis cleans it. Now, why doesn't the southern hemisphere turn orange? 90% of the human population lives in the northern hemisphere. So there's less landmass and far less people, and far less industry, and far less pollution in the southern hemisphere. Next, please. So when that CO2 gets near water, any water, it will exchange as a gas from the gas atmosphere into the water, and wind increases the surface area of the water so that more absorption occurs, and this occurs on the ocean. So we get an exchange of CO2 going in and out of the ocean. Well, once it gets into the water, then turbulence, whirlpools, other things tend to pull it down and mix into layers. Now, the ocean has many layers. They call it thermohaline layers, because salt concentration and temperature create layers. And something we don't have a good handle on is the exchange of CO2 gas and other forms of CO2 between the layers. But we know it occurs. We just don't understand the dynamics or the kinetics of that process. Well, once CO2 goes in, a little bit of chemistry here on the lower one, the gas dissolves and stays dissolved in the water, but some of it interacts with water to form carbonic acid, H2CO3. Well, that immediately dissociates. I've drawn those arrows to indicate the favored direction to go. And so when we get carbonic acid, that readily dissociates into a proton, an acid, and bicarbonate, which also is partially acidic, partially basic. But that proton then can attack calcium carbonate, releasing the calcium and locking up the carbonate so that it can't go back to calcium. Calcium carbonate occurs in the ocean as a molecule that we call aragonite. And the aragonite saturation level is very important to the species that create shells that incorporate calcium carbonate, such as oysters, pteropods, crab. Anything that's got a little bit of calcium carbonate in it, they're having trouble because we have more acidification. We're robbing CO2 or carbonate from them and creating more bicarbonate in the water. Next slide, please. So just like oxygen, carbon dioxide is more soluble in cold, and the blue panel is pre-industrial area. The next intermediate panel is current levels, and then above is predicted levels. So the colder the water, more CO2. At any temperature, we now have more CO2 in our water. And there's another phenomena that if the pH is lower, then more CO2 gas dissolves. So it exacerbates the problem. Next slide, please. Well, this is a problem for the oyster industry because of upwelling. So here we see upwelling in blue near shore. You can see near Washington and Oregon, where we have upwelling near shore. What happens is in the summertime, a north wind blows, and the Coriolis effect causes water, the surface water, to shift away from shore, and then cold water comes up to displace that vacancy. And this is rich in nutrients. It's very important to our fisheries. But it's also richer in CO2 now. It's acidic. And even the oysters have learned to spawn when they feel cold and warm. That's what they do in the hatcheries. They change the temperature a few times on them, and then they spawn. And that occurs at the end of the summer when these north winds would blow. But that's not happening out in the wild, so we've had to go to hatcheries. And then they spawn, but because of the acid, that aragonite, that calcium concentration, is not strong enough for them to build their shell, which they need to do in a few days. And so they die. And so we don't get in the oyster industry what's called a set, because the spawn happened, but nobody anchored onto another shell and started going to work. Well, that water is 50 years old, and that exchange between layers, that's the part we don't know a lot about right now. But what does it mean? Was this CO2 50 years ago? Or is it because of CO2 now that's exchanging with that lower level? We don't know. It's really frightening to think that it's from 50 years ago. Next slide, please. Well, this is a very complex slide, and it's basically about the carbon cycle. But I want you to notice the light green and the light pink microbes. The microbes in the ocean constitute 90% of the biological mass. So all the whales and fish and everything else is only 10%. And DNA voyages, after we got the human genome, the guy whose actual, most of his genome was discovered, had a big yacht, so he fitted it for science and sent it around the world. And what he found is there are tens of thousands of microbes in a drop of water that we know nothing about. Well, we know maybe 5 to 10% of them. But the other 90% we can only recognize because we haven't seen their DNA before. So we just don't know a whole lot about the microbes in the ocean, yet they are part of the food chain. The bottom of the food chain, bacteria, provide food for just about everything else that goes up. And they do processes, and we don't know what's going on with that, with acidification and heating of the water. So I put the title down there. The scientists are warning us. We need to understand this more, because this is our life system from the ocean. Thank you.
Okay, Bill.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate the opportunity to be here. Sort of new to the organization, but I just kind of want to give a brief overview of the Yakima Nation Fisheries Program and the Yakima Nation. So this first slide you see here is the Yakimas are a treaty tribe. They signed a treaty with the federal government in June of 1855 in Walla Walla. And that treaty really laid the foundation for the Yakima Nation's roles and responsibilities to take care of the fish and wildlife and resources. The map there shows the 1.5 million acre reservation there in Toppenish. And then in addition to that, Chief Kamayakan at the signing indicated that his people, the 14 tribes and bands that made up the Yakima, his people needed this central part of Washington State. Well, Washington State wasn't a state yet, but that 12.6 million acres is what was ceded to the federal government with the tribal members' ability to exercise their treaty rights for gathering in usual and custom areas and fishing and gathering areas. That language directly from the treaty indicates that this was such a vital piece. There were minutes taken of that during the treaty in 1855 where it was clear and apparent to Governor Stevens of the Washington Territory that the tribes would not sign any type of treaty if these fishing rights were not guaranteed. And so that basically laid the foundation for the fisheries program, which really got built in earnest in the early 80s. We're one of the largest fisheries organizations in the country. We have offices up and down Natal, Portland, Klickitat, Yakima. And we have a really simple agenda. It's honor, protect, restore. And that is honor the tribal members and leadership that have got us to this position, protect the resources given to the tribal members by the Creator, and restore. Do whatever we can to build resiliency into these populations that need it desperately. And so that is an effort that my team and I really focus on in the restoration piece. Next slide, please. So obviously one of the big things we're looking at is wet meadow restoration. Headwater streams where we have the ability to recreate that sponge so we can release those waters cool back during summer base flows. Absolutely imperative that we do as much of that wherever we can. Down below in that far right picture, you can see we did a 14-mile stretch of the Klickitat River where we are reconnecting floodplain, restoring floodplain function. And that's another effort we're really behind is preservation of lands, working with Land Trust, but also thinking big scale, reach size projects, not the little pinpoint projects that you may be familiar with, a little log jam here, log jam there. It's time to think big and out of the box. On this side, we do hatchery work as well. We're we feel one of the innovators in scientifically based hatchery reform methods like we have over in the Yakima. Our kelp reconditioning program is probably tops in the Northwest as far as restoring steelhead, which are really tricky fish to run through hatcheries. So we've elected not to do that. We capture the spawned out adults at various locations, get them back on feed, release them, and bolster the population there, because as some may know, steelhead don't necessarily die after spawning. They can repeat spawn, but coming through the hydro system is a real challenge for big fish. We have restored sockeye to the Yakima River. We've restored extirpated coho to the Wenatchee. We're on the cusp of restoring summer chinook to the Yakima Basin as well. Next slide. One area of focus, and again, this is to build resiliency into these populations. We have just an altered hydro system, obviously, with the main stem and Columbia dams, and a much impaired system, particularly at these bottlenecks, which is a literal bottleneck, where the river and the production coming out of these Washington side tributaries where I work hits this impounded area with shallow, warm habitat that ramps up and down with power 2 feet a day, 7 feet seasonally. We lose a lot of production in these areas. The juvenile salmon are stranded during these ramping events. Pacific lamprey emicetes, which love that sort of sediment habitat, they get desiccated, lose a lot of production there. You see lamprey below ordinary pool, but in these areas that are affected, they're really being decimated. So we're taking a hard look at these areas, and we have some ideas. And next slide. One of those is a project I had the opportunity to work on for the Yakima people, and that was after Condit Dam came out in October 26, 2011, at 11:35 p.m. And they hit the blow and go. A lot of sediments landed at the mouth there of the White Sand. Yeah. And so we had the opportunity to restore that tribal village site, the Inlu site. And as we developed plans for that, we sort of butted head with the Corps of Engineers. Hopefully there's no Corps of Engineers folks in the audience. But we had a real challenge with them. As there was some sort of newly emergent wetland plants on that sediment bar there, you can see in the top right. We identified that, there's some newly emergent wetland plants, but it's not a wetland. We got to think outside the box. This is one of those areas that ramped and killed fish. And it took us an extra year of battling back and forth, and we said, look, we don't want to make any more of this. You guys got plenty of it up and down the line. So we, with tribal muscle and some legislative muscle, we had things turned around, and we were able to basically excavate 15,000 cubic yards and put them on that sandbar and elevate them above ordinary high pool. And what that did is it took out of play about 6 acres of that destructive habitat, that impaired habitat that kills fish. And those islands there, or that bar there, seem to be revegetated. Ultimately, that will have a nice riparian gallery, large mature trees that are going to sequester carbon rather than release methane in the warming river and those broad, shallow deltas. It's going to also minimize the number of warm water predators you see in there, which, as we know, and some of the EPA modeling of temperature modeling in Columbia and looking at cold water refugia areas, we know we're going to, 2040, we're probably going to see a 23 degrees C Columbia River in August. In 2080, maybe 24 degrees C. So these cold water tributaries like the White Salmon, Wind, Klickitat, Hood, there's really 13 primary ones from the mouth up to the chutes that EPA did a real intensive study on. And that is really some of our marching orders now, is how to preserve those cold water refuges, how to enhance them. So we know that, as you guys may remember 2015, that awful year we had with such a warm Columbia, virtually 95% of the sockeye moving upstream died. If you sat at the mouth of the white salmon right there, you'd just see one after the other coming into a state. So we know that that's on the horizon, and we know to build resiliency in these populations, we're going to have to take serious measures. That lower right picture over there, that is from that EPA cold water refusion study. I recommend folks take a look at that. But it shows the warm water, and there are ways to fix this. And I think you'll see a lot more from the Yakima and Warm Springs and some of the other sovereigns in the area really demanding this, because the fish that we're preserving are a right guaranteed under the treaty for ceremonial subsistence and, if abundant enough, commercial. And obviously DFW and all the other partners that we have here are trying to restore those fisheries for recreational fisheries, commercial fisheries, which are privileges under the state of Washington. So there's a real distinct difference, we feel, between rights and privileges. So next slide, please. Another big thing we do is education and outreach. We have a big program in the gorge, and I just threw this up here because I did some research on you guys before I came to talk, and found that this chapter includes Micronesia and U.S. protectorates. So as part of our Salmon in the Classroom thing we do in the gorge, partnered with the Fish and Wildlife Service, we go out and we raise fish in classrooms, and kids get to release them and really get to understand the life cycle of the salmon. Through World Oregon, I don't know if folks are familiar with that, but it's a cultural exchange program out of Portland. We had the opportunity to visit with some young high school students from Micronesia, Marshall Islands, Palau, Yap, some of the other islands, and you can see in the top there, I went out and bought a world map so they could put pins in them, and some of the kids couldn't even find their island where they're from. But it was really telling to me, and I learned more from them about what they're up against. The young woman from the Marshalls was telling me about how her grandmother had to move, her mom had to move. They're holding the line at 1.5 degrees C. They have a saying is 1.5 to stay alive, and it was really telling to me. And I think wherever obviously we can, the interaction with each other individually or as groups, it's so key. So anyway, just wanted to add that piece. Thank you.
I don't have any slides. Keeping it simple. I don't have any technical data for you. My perspective has come from the shellfish industry and trying to bring our 700 acres in Willapa Bay of oyster beds and clam beds back to life. We haven't used them since 2004, and so I requested that our enterprises take control of those and try to bring them back and do our good due diligence in our bay to help clean our water and keep it clean. And we've set some policies and introduce our tribe. I'm from Shoalwater Bay, which is the lowest and smallest tribe in Washington State on the lower southern coast. And we're on the Tokeland Peninsula that is cornered from the ocean and the Willapa Bay. And we do not have a treaty where we can only fish and hunt within reservation boundaries, and the trust boundaries are a little over 336 acres of land. So we've had a really hard time trying to keep cultural, traditional fishing going, and we have one commercial fisherman. He actually is a crabber, and he is about to retire. And so we're losing all of our cultural practices when it comes to fishing. And so trying to get those rights and just access to the bay and practice cultural ways is really important to us. We've fought for it for a long time. We currently are creating a wetland mitigation bank, restoring some of our tidelands back to their original state and trying to be a part of whatever we can to help further the future of our people. Our biggest mission in life is to become self-sustained and be able to provide for our people and create a safe and flourishing future for our people. Something we're doing right now is we've created an adaptation plan. So we're in the midst of that. And so we're currently identifying the different plants and animals that we need to try to restore or protect. In the past, one that we have worked with is the pink sand verbena, because we have a lot of erosion going on north of us, and we feel that restoring that plant that has disappeared from our coastline might help hold our beach together. My personal goal as the planner for the tribe, I really want to look at what's going on in our bay and our oyster beds, because I hear all the commercial oyster growers talking about ghost shrimp and how they're overtaking their beds. And ghost shrimp have been around for a very long time, but suddenly they're just taking over. So why is that? My mind says I need to look at the roots of those things, so I've been advocating that our natural resources really put some time into identifying roots rather than trying to treat the problem and spray things. And because we have rules that our tribal council have put on us on these oyster beds, we cannot use chemicals, we can't spray anything. We're going to do our best to be good stewards of that land. So we have to be creative and look to our roots. And one of my focuses has been, the green sturgeon and salmon. They're predators. And what's going on with them? What's going on with the temperatures of the sea? And I constantly am talking about this with people in my conversations, just trying to get people to think about that root cause of what could really be happening. I'm just going to share this right now because I know it's the second question, but one of the points in time that I can think of when it came to, do I believe in climate change? I went to an adaptation planning course, and during that course we were in La Jolla Beach, California, and at the Scripps Institute they have this pier that has been there since 1916. They've been collecting the data, and they had the hottest water temperatures while we were there at this course ever. It was 80 degrees out in the water, and you could see swarms of seaweed dying and coming up on the beaches. And so that was really interesting to me. But the piece of data that really got me, and I think this is super important, is educating people and showing them the facts and the data, which you guys are doing a great job. I was really impressed with some of this data. I took a history course, and looking back at population growth, and during this course I'm looking at the sea level rise charts and the carbon rise charts, and about 40 years down the line they're almost identical. Population growth, engines, and the Industrial Revolution, it aligns. I mean, it's a perfect picture when you compare those two charts, our population versus those things. So that was the point in time that I became a true believer, and that we needed to do something. We're impacting things so quickly now because of that population growth. And something funny that happens in those conversations around the reservation, we like to joke around a lot on the reservation, and my aunt and I were talking one day, and we thought, well, maybe the sea is rising because there's so many people on the land, and it's displacing the water. So there's a lot of theories, but I think education is really important, and supporting sovereign nations and getting the rights to help with those things so we can bring our cultural roots into practice and help in these situations is really important. We have so many resources we could be bringing forth to help in this fight, so we do lack capacity in a lot of places, but we have those cultural foundations that could be brought forth into it. And something else I wanted to bring up also is recently I read an article, it was October 27th, 2019. Wall Street spends millions to buy Washington State water. And that is really concerning to me when it comes to these rivers and fisheries that are along these rivers and our fish's future. We're getting money into our water. That's going to be dangerous. There's that famous saying by a chief that, you know, someday when are people going to realize you can't eat money? You know, keep that in mind as we move forward. So.
Talking about the data, I think one of our hopes is that providing data regarding how the climate change is impacting waters can be part of the arsenal that CCL members can have when we go back to our chapters and so on. Our last speaker on this point then is Steve Jones, and Steve, you're up.
Thanks. Really flattered to be on this panel. I'm not a scientist. The most I know about fish is how to catch them. But I want to cover three topics here. And we heard Bill talk about it, Jim as well. Cold water refuge is key for salmon and steelhead. Where is it? How fast are we losing it? And is there an enduring refuge? Is the three things I think are most important to question in this. And the next slide. Water temperature and stream flow go hand in hand. We saw Jim Burns' data on that earlier. You can't have strong flows and cold water. Well, you can't have really good flows if the water's warm. You can have a hot river, but it's not going to sustain the fish. And as temperatures rise, river flows commonly decline, and many small streams become intermittent. By intermittent, I mean, you know, once May arrives, it starts warming beyond the ability to sustain fish, and maybe by July it's entirely dry. Or maybe by August or September it's entirely dry. Intermittent streams are incapable of supporting trout and salmon. Next slide. So what this illustrates right here is work that was done and just published in the fourth quarter in the Journal of Hydrology by Christian Yeager up at the Water Science Center in Tacoma. What she has done is taken together stream flow and temperature data back to the 1920s and then combined them into a mathematical formula that actually maps the permanence probability of a stream. So the title above the bar at the bottom is permanence probability. So what you're seeing there is don't interpret the red as just heat. It's not that, or the blue is cold, although it is to a certain degree. What those colors represent is the probability of permanence, that flow will be there. So if you look all the way to the right, I mean, those are 80 to 85% probability of permanence. Those deep blue areas are probably always going to be flowing at levels and temperatures to sustain trout and salmon. And if you go all the way to the left in the redmost colors, the probability is going to diminish towards unsustainability. So this is a good visual map of where the temperature gradient is going to be vanishing for salmon and steelhead in the Northwest. If you look over into Idaho, that's the headwaters of the Snake, a lot of them. If you head over to the Idaho-Oregon border, there's the Oahe and those high desert rivers. If you look across that plain at the top in the northwest corner of Oregon, that's the John Day, which is one of the most important native steelhead habitats on the lower Columbia. So you can see there's a lot of lot of area in the Northwest that is at risk of becoming too intermittent to sustain salmon and trout. So next slide. And so we all know what that means. Warming intermittent streams have consequences. And we've already heard other speakers talk about the 2015 drought. Here's just a few headlines from papers of them. But it's not just here. If you'll notice that there's a Canadian broadcasting story from 2018 where they were concerned about rivers on Vancouver Island being too warm to sustain sport fishing. The stress on the fish would be too much, and so they asked sportsmen to step away from the water. So it has a real consequence for people like myself who enjoy the sport, but the sport of fishing, but it's also got major consequences for all of us because those species require cold, clear water to sustain themselves. So next slide. So by 2040, climate models, this is some work by Kristen Yeager that I pointed out earlier, predict that warming waters could cost native trout and salmon more than 1/3 to 1/2 of their habitat in the Northwest. Most of the losses would be in Oregon and Idaho at lower elevations. By lower elevations, I'm talking about 36 to 5,000, and then under 3,600 feet. So those tributaries to the John Day, to the Chutes, those high desert lakes, the Coulee Lakes in Washington, those are the areas we're talking about. The good news is that trout could persist in certain headwaters, and the vast majority of those are on public land. If we could switch to the next slide, you could launch that web, Brian. On your handout that went around, the first item on here is access to an interactive database that Brian's just called up here. That I can show you how it works a little bit. You can use this to look for yourself at the kind of science we're talking about. What you see in this map right here is this particular map is based on bull and West Slope cutthroat trout. So what you're seeing in the deepest blue are the habitats where it is most likely to persist by 2040. So if you could zoom in a little bit, Brian, give it a minute to load here and zoom down. And you can actually see stream by stream. And what I want to show you right here is where we've got the deepest color blue. It's almost purple in this representation, but it's blue on most web screens. Those are the persistent waters. They are going to remain cold enough to sustain those species at high elevations. When you go into the green water, they're going to be less permanent, more intermittent, all the way down to the yellow waters, which will be, by 2040, pretty reliably seasonal. They will be uninhabitable by those two species of trout, that's bull and West Slope cutthroat. So there is science going on this quite aggressively right now, and this website can give you access to one of the most remarkable applications and illustrations of that science going on. And it can show you what's going on in your backyard. Right there's Mount Hood. Talk about backyard. So thanks very much. Happy to answer questions.
Thank you, Steve. Could we just, this is, as you can see, a talented panel, and they're here on their own time, of course. Could we give them a round of applause? I'm going to just ask one more question, and then we'll take questions from the audience if you have any. And I guess the question I'd like to put to the panel is that CCL is an advocacy group. Are there approaches or methods that we might suggest that would be helpful in getting sports or fishermen politically active on the fight involving climate change?
I'll start, I guess. You know, as the last talk, the previous session that the gentleman indicated, tribes have a lot going on, and they're up against it on multiple fronts. But maybe one thing I might recommend is just those personal connections again. As folks may know, there's a lot of first feast ceremonies coming up, Celilo, Rock Creek, Klickitat, some of these places where the public's welcome, and I would, folks that might want to just engage tribal members on an individual level, that could be a good start. One thing unique about tribes, and the Yakimas are about 11,000 member tribe, but each one of those individuals has a direct contact to their government. They know they're related to them many times. They interact a lot with and have representation by those elected officials. They know the key points in the Department of Natural Resources to contact and such. So I just might, thinking out loud, might recommend something like that.
Anybody else?
Well, I can speak for the sport fishing community that I know. There are some 14 fly fishing clubs in the state of Washington. They have meetings, monthly meetings, about 10 months a year, so there's a good venue to offer, contacting each of these clubs, offer a speaker's evening. There is a willing audience out there there are many fishermen who are concerned about this, many fly fishermen in particular, because we're a little bit closer to the conservation issues than power boaters, but they are as well. I mean, anybody who puts a boat on the Columbia and goes after spring Chinook is really troubled by what's been happening in the oceans, and I think there are many of those groups that would welcome a well-planned and entertaining presentation about climate change and your issues. So reach out, ask the sports groups. I'm sure there'd be many who'd be willing to hear from you.
All right, thank you. Any questions from the audience?
You've been talking about warmer water, and I'm from Oregon, and I don't know how much difference there is, but I'm concerned of the reports that we're going to have hotter and drier, there'll be just less water, period.
So the question is that you're more concerned about there being less water, period? Okay.
You talked about the streams being intermittent. That means
Right.
there's nothing coming.
Yeah,
You don't get the snow.
Yeah, the Norwest modeling for stream flow and temperature, for example, one of the basins I work in at Klickitat, they're looking at probably a 30 to 40% reduction in base flow. And that's one of the main reasons why we're aggressively going after wetland restoration, moving for roads out of the valley bottom, reconnecting floodplains, establishing that sponge again. Because we know it's on the horizon with the diminishment of base flows.
Yeah, and you can see right here in this map that's up right now, the Salem is kind of in the lower left-hand corner of that map, and so you can see directly to the right of it. Yeah, those are the Sandy M. That's the north and south Sandy M drainages right there, and you can see there is going to be a high degree of those feeder streams into those two rivers that will become intermittent. So you're right, it will be less water. It's not that it's going to, this north and south Sandy M are still going to be there, and they're still going to be steelhead, but the numbers that they sustain, it's going to be dramatically reduced simply by temperature gradient.
So not only is climate change making things warmer, but it's also changing the form of precipitation that we get. Getting a lot less snow now and a lot more rain. So that rain runs through the system and by summer it's lost. Whereas in the past we would rely on snow, glaciers to kind of keep those flows up throughout the summer period. And when I look at base flows for the East Fork Lewis, they're really down. I think they reached their lowest in 2018 at less than 40. cubic feet per second. So that's pretty stressful when you see that volume of water just moving away.
Okay, thank you. Yes. Thanks.
I guess a question for Bill. Understanding that a lot of the, restoration has been focused kind of in the past on those salmon species where, are endangered or threatened. And as you look at, things like this graph that show potentially populations that are in good shape now but may not be in the future, how does, somebody like Yakima figure out where you're going to distribute resources? In other words, you'd be spending a ton on, let's say, trying to preserve a potential salmon run that is already on the brink, or do you devote more resources to protecting those strongholds that exist today and have the potential to into the future?
Yeah, that's a real challenge for us. Protecting the strongholds is key. Understanding a warming Columbia River and fish that need to make it into the upper Columbia, for example, a fall Chinook. They're coming into the Columbia in that sort of August time frame. As cold water diminish, are they going to, once you hit that last one at the Deschutes, you've got a long way through John Day Pool up and around the corner. But the fall Chinook have their sub-yearling life history where they go out as fry in, they don't have to spend about 18 months in fresh water like a spring Chinook, which are going to have an impact in their freshwater environment, those headwater streams. And so that is something we're looking at in our climate adaptation plan. That's on the list of handouts or website. We're also looking at an action plan, and that is something right now we're working on in the fisheries program, is looking at sustainability of various stocks of fisheries through space and time. And we're really at a unique place in sort of research and science where we, I don't know that we've ever known, well, we should have known, but now we really do know what's on the horizon. You would always sort of plan and model and do things for basically static, but now we know what's on the horizon. So one other point is this big effort in the Yakima Basin, the integrated plan. It's irrigators, Yakima Nation Fisheries, and others have got together. $1 billion ag industry in that valley. To Jim's point, the snowpack was the 5th reservoir in that basin. They're planning on that not having the impact that it did to release those flows. So they're looking at raising reservoirs, and again, the power of a treaty tribe. In that basin, when essentially the water was adjudicated for the Yakima River, the tribe, through that process, affirmed that their water right is since time immemorial to preserve fish and fish flows. And we have fought forever for that. And finally, through this integrated plan, I think there is hope into that future. We know the lower Yakima is going to be a really tricky corridor for fish to move through. So, there might be things where we truck fish around hotspots, things like that. So, it's going to be a real challenge, but we've got our sleeves rolled up. I hope that answers your question.
Question?
Yes, thank you. I really appreciate the panel today inviting us with how much better handle we have on the impacts of these changes, which wholly are not positive. And even with looking at a national policy and putting a price on carbon with CCL, there are differences of opinion about how we should structure the solutions. And I guess my general question to you is, given how much more we know about the science and the impacts, are there still deep divisions in how we ought to go about addressing the future impacts? Is there much uniformity? Is this kind of a new stage for fisheries and understanding policies that we ought to be pursuing and adapting to address these challenges?
Jim?
I know everybody in this table's got an opinion on this, but we were losing fisheries long before global warming became a real issue. Even science identified it. I mean, we were losing fisheries in the 50s and 60s and 70s, and it's largely because of, harvest practice, dams, management of buffers on streams through commercial forests and so on. So when you say, there are some people that believe the solution is still, let's just build more hatcheries. That's the solution, just build more hatcheries. They're out there, they're in the Washington legislature, I see them every week when I'm out there. So the answer is yes, there is division, but I think the science is winning.
Anybody else?
I know Jim has dealt with this many times over his career.
Yeah, I would agree. They always talk about the 4 H's: hydro, harvest, habitat, hatcheries, thank you. So there's always squabbling about that. And I think there's a 5th H, kind of the human mind. And we can see what's going on, and we need to come to some rational solutions. And in the world of fish, rationality doesn't happen all the time.
We'll need another hour on this seminar.
Yes, we
Boy, we've got.
would. We need to thank our panel right now. It's time for.
I know these guys, I think they'll stay and answer a few questions if you want to stay. There's a handout, if you didn't get it, let me know, they're floating around. Steve's interactive map is cited on that, and could we give one more round of applause?